The year is 1944, and over Ludwigshafen, Germany, a raid of American B-24 Liberators have just released their payloads. Flying in the front of this formation and leading the entire 445th Bomb Group is the most famous aviator in the United States Army Air Force. In the cockpit was none other than Jimmy Stewart, newly discovered movie star and priceless asset of Hollywood giant MGM Studios. After leaving the target area of Ludwigshafen, Stewart would be faced with one of the most difficult decisions of his life: protecting himself and his crew, or attempting to save a nearby group of bombers that had just made a fatal mistake. And unbeknown to him, this decision would go on to potentially change his career, leading him and his men straight into a clash with the most notorious bomber killer in history. In 1940, James Maitland Stewart had only just recently entered the Hollywood scene, but he had quickly shown that he was destined for stardom after his performances in multiple box office hits like You Can't Take It With You and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. However, the young actor, going by the name Jimmy, was far from the breed of celebrities that we see today. He was not satisfied with becoming a movie star. Coming from a military family, he knew that there were more important things, and he wanted to do his part. So, in 1941, 9 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Stewart enlisted and became a part of the U.S. Army Air Force. Less than 1 year later, on January 1st of 1942, he received his commission as a lieutenant, just 3 weeks after the United States entered the war. Although still under contract with MGM Studios, Stewart ceased work on any commercial films and instead devoted all of his time and attention to the Air Corps. Having already flown on his own before enlistment, he was able to move through training quickly and found himself up in the ranks at a faster pace than most cadets. But unfortunately, due to his public status, most of his work in 1942 and 43 was relegated to the training of new pilots. But this was not what he wanted. Jimmy wanted to be a part of the war and fight for his country like everyone else. In the summer of 1943, a rumor was passed around that Stewart would soon be moved to a war bond tour and to exclusive radio and film work for the Army Air Force. This gossip was the breaking point. Up until this point, Jimmy had not ever used his public status with the Air Force for his own gain. But now he felt as if he wasn't getting his fair share to contribute, and he knew that he could not take the attention and monotony of a celebrity bond tour. So he went to his commanding officer and pleaded for a new assignment, anything that would get him closer to the front. And luckily for Stewart, Colonel Walter Arnold sympathized for him. Despite the fact that most in the Air Force wanted such a priceless propaganda figure to remain stateside, Arnold found an opportunity. The 703rd Bomb Squadron, a member of the heavy 445th Bomb Group, was in need of an operations officer, as they were about to ship out to England to join the 8th Air Force. This position required time flying B-24 Liberators and command experience, both of which were attributes that Stewart possessed. This was not necessarily someone who would fly in consistent combat missions, as many such positions gave the officers the option of choosing which, if any, missions that they flew. But it would get him involved with a combat unit and would see him ship out shortly to England. Stewart was thrilled and jumped at the opportunity, and soon enough found himself across the Atlantic. However, he would not last long in this position. Before he even arrived in England in November of 1943, Jimmy Stewart was promoted to squadron commander, and now found himself leading the entire 703rd Squadron, And what MGM Studios and the US Air Force had failed to realize is that Stewart would not take the easy route in his duties, but instead would opt to fly with his men far more than most commanding officers, and soon enough would find himself on many of the most difficult bombing raids of World War II. This would begin after a brief training period in England when the 445th was officially cleared for its first combat mission. But while Stewart and his men get ready for this debut mission, there's one other B-24 story that has to be mentioned, and that's my new short film, Return Engagement, and I'm happy to finally announce that it will be premiering on streaming platform HistoryFix on July 4th. HistoryFix, who is also kind enough to sponsor this video, is a streaming platform by history buffs for history buffs, providing ad-free curated shows from all sorts of creators. That's why they partnered with me to help bring you guys this special short film on 2 World War II veterans from the same bomber crew, and the moment that they meet up for their final toast. Plus, I'm also bringing a lot of other new content there, with exclusive deleted scenes that you won't find here on YouTube. In addition, they have tons of other documentaries and compelling fictional stories, like one I recently enjoyed, Nisei, on the courageous journey of 2 Japanese-American soldiers during World War II. Enjoy this and tons of other great content on your TV, tablet, phone, or computer with the HistoryFix streaming apps, all without ads or any of the other drama, just great history content from creators like me. So head to historyfix.com and use promo code TJ3 History to get 30% off the monthly plan. And enjoy Return Engagement, premiering July 4th, and everything else that HistoryFix has to offer. Now, the fortresses are started and the first mission for the 445th Bomb Group was about to begin. This would take place on December 13th of 1943, when the group was assigned to strike the submarine pins at Kiel, Germany. This would be no milk run and was a long mission over the North Atlantic, and Stewart would make sure that he was on the list. As the bombers struck Kiel and the 445th received their baptism by fire, it became clear that Stewart was perfect for the role of squadron commander. Being 35 years old, he was far more mature and calm under pressure than the 19 and 20-year-olds that he commanded. This made him a natural leader in the air. Furthermore, on his next missions, like that on the 16th of December when he led the entire group over Bremen, his film experience actually proved to be quite helpful. His enunciation and speaking over the radio was crystal clear and lacked nothing. And although this may seem like a small detail, communication and timely instruction in such an endeavor can be the difference between life and death. His voice commanded respect, and the men soon came to find out that so did his actions. After taking part in his first few missions, the media was dying to get an interview with the Hollywood icon at his airfield in Tibenham, England. But Stewart refused to make the service about himself and declined all such requests to instead keep the focus on his men and their safety. And they would need it, for as the calendar turned to 1944, things were about to get far more difficult for many of the men of the mighty 8th. In early 1944, a new plan was being implemented with the heavy bombers of the U.S. Army Air Force. Their targets would begin to deepen into Germany, and a decisive battle with the Luftwaffe was about to begin. One of these first missions would take place on January 7th of 1944, when the 445th Bomb Group was assigned to hit the oil refineries at Ludwigshafen, Germany. This was a target well into Europe, with many of the strongest defenses all along the route. Here we can see the assigned path for one of the other groups on the mission on January 7th. Note how precise the route is, especially the turn away from the target, designed to take the bombers away from many of the worst defenses. During a mission like this, the plan was for bomb groups to follow the same path, one after another, allowing for each unit to be protected by those in front and behind. This made the formations more challenging for German fighters to hit, as tight and denser bomber groups put up much heavier defenses against interceptors. But unfortunately, things would not go according to plan. As the 445th approached Ludwigshafen, led by Stewart himself, all went well. Bomb bay doors were opened and the payloads were dropped, striking the oil refineries below. Then, just as the map plan had stated, Stewart led his group in a hard turn to the right, heading west towards the closest coast of France. But as the turn began, he noticed that something wasn't right. The group in front of his, the 389th Bomb Group, had apparently made a wrong turn. Instead of turning at the appropriate heading back to England, they were off by 30 degrees and were now headed towards Paris. Quickly, Stewart decided to break radio silence and radioed the commander of the 389th, Major Kenneth Caldwell, flying in a B-24 by the name of Trouble, trying to tell him of his incorrect heading. But the officer replied back stating, "Get off the radio, I know what I'm doing," insisting that he would remain on the current course. The Liberator, called Trouble, was indeed living up to her name. According to most sources, this was a navigational mistake, but one source did state that Major Caldwell did this because he refused to fly at reduced speed behind the B-17s a few miles in front. This left Stewart leading the entire 445th in a very difficult situation. He knew that the 389th was currently headed off course, away from the protection of the groups before and after, making them a prime target for Luftwaffe fighters. If Stewart left him and proceeded on the correct course back to England, the 389th would almost certainly be targeted and slaughtered, flying alone and unprotected. But if Stewart followed them on the incorrect course, they would have some additional protection. But Stewart would then be exposing his own group to additional risk in the process. At 25,000 feet over Germany, Jimmy Stewart opted for the more difficult option, to risk his own safety and that of his men to try and protect a fellow group of B-24s. For he knew that without them flying nearby to protect, the 389th would be in a very bad spot. And so the 445th Bomb Group, led by a Hollywood celebrity, turned purposely onto an incorrect heading and followed the confused 389th. Stewart fortunately planned for the worst and immediately ordered his Liberators to tighten up their formation as closely as possible, as he was aware that German fighters always picked the loosest formation to attack. Little did he know that as the 445th tightened up, the Luftwaffe was already preparing a strike, and it would be led by one of the most lethal pilots of World War II. On the ground, German radar had detected the misstep by the Americans almost immediately. This was precisely the sort of mistake that the Luftwaffe waited for, and thus fighters were vectored straight to the location of the two bomber groups. These particular interceptors would be Focke-Wulf 190s of JG2, led by the most acclaimed bomber killer in the Luftwaffe, Egon Meyer. Meyer had developed much of the strategy behind bomber attack and had led the defense of the Reich, currently with a mind-boggling 94 kills to his name, including a staggering 22 heavy American bombers. At approximately 1:15, near the French city of Orleans, Meyer and JG2 arrived over the Liberator flights. Looking at their possible target, it was clear that the 389th was the loosest flying, and so he led his men in for the attack. In the opening pass, the lead bomber, which had made the crucial navigational mistake, paid for it with their lives, as Meyer executed his signature head-on attack and blew the lead bomber from the sky. In this, 10 of the 11 crew members on board were killed, with one single man surviving, the bald turret gunner, Sergeant Robert Sweat, who later went on to describe the moment of Meyer's attack. I heard the top turret gunner open fire with 2 short bursts. Then I felt the plane shudder as enemy fire hit us. The nose seemed to tip up, and it felt as if the plane almost stopped in midair. As the plane fell, it was spinning faster and faster. The centrifugal force built until it was crushing me. It felt like a 500-pound weight on my chest. I couldn't breathe. Then there was a huge explosion, and I blacked out. Jimmy Stewart in his B-24 could only watch in horror as he and his group kept as close as possible, warding off any attacks from the rear of the exposed 389th. Luckily, as instructed, his unit was flying so tightly that the German fighters did not bother attacking the 445th. But the 389th continued to pay for the mistake and lost 3 more B-24s at the hands of Meyer and his men. These would be B-24 Heavy Date, flown by Lieutenant Carl Mattson; B-24 Los Angeles City Limits, flown by Lieutenant Earl Cooper; and Blunderbuss, a B-24 flown by Lieutenant Roy Smith. Interestingly, from the missing aircrew report maps, we can see the location of these shootdowns being here, just south of Paris and north of Orleans. And with a little research, these match up perfectly with Egon Meyer's claims of 2 B-24s downed at shortly past 1 p.m., just north of Orleans. Furthermore, we can compare the planned route map for this mission and see just how far off the planned path this took them, leading to the disaster. Fortunately, preventing an all-out massacre was the 445th close by, keeping the German fighters from swarming the Lonesome Formation. After a few long minutes, the attack ended, and the 2 groups were over the channel and arriving at England. The 389th limped home, licking their wounds, and the 445th, through their steadfast leadership, made it back to Tivenham unscathed, not losing a single bomber. Shortly after this mission, the commander of the 389th, Colonel Milton Arnold, sent a letter to the commander of the 445th, Colonel Robert Terrell, commending Jimmy Stewart for his actions on the January 7th mission to Ludwigshafen. Because of this, Stewart was promoted to major as it became clear that he was one of the most valiant and natural leaders in the 8th Air Force. This was not the end of Stewart's trying combat missions, however, as just a few short weeks later, he would take part in Big Week, flying 2 of the most difficult missions of the war on February 21st and 25th of 1944. In these, the 445th, like most groups participating, took heavy losses, but Stewart was able to make it home safely, leading by example and inspiring the men under his command. Unfortunately, around this time, the U.S. Army Air Force decided that Stewart had now proven himself, even without his Hollywood status, as too valuable a man to lose. He had now received a Distinguished Flying Cross and outranked almost all other combat pilots in the 8th Air Force. He was soon transferred to the 453rd Bomb Group and was assigned to the role of Group Operations Officer, in charge of planning all of the details for missions and briefing crews on each assignment. After the war ended, in keeping with his unmatched humility and commitment to focusing on the men who fought, Stewart always refused to speak about his military experience publicly and forbade mention of it by his publicist, which is why it is fairly unknown today. After his service, he continued his Hollywood stardom and played in multiple classics that can still be found on TV today, like It's a Wonderful Life. But despite multiple attempts, he always refused to play in any roles relating to World War II, or his service. Instead, he kept his humble nature and kept his service simply as part of his duty as an American, taking pride in doing what was right for his country. If you enjoyed this documentary, please consider joining my Patreon to support my work and get your name here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.